I'm delighted to welcome you all this afternoon. The session is titled Academic Freedom with or Without Responsibility, Truth and Social Justice in the Flint Water Crisis. And what I hope this panel helps us get is the Flint tragedy is actually a microcosm of our modern culture, especially our modern academic culture, a problem of academic freedom without responsibility. My name is SIDDHARTHA Roy. I am an assistant professor at Rutgers. I will do very brief introductions. First up, Dr. Hernan Gomez. He's a pediatrician at the Hurley Medical Center and an associate professor at the University of Michigan's health system. He's also a medical toxicologist, which is important. And why is that?
Medical toxicology, I like to say that I view medical toxicology as being the Rodney Dangerfield of medical specialties, because his tagline being, "I don't get no respect." And this is because even other physicians are like, when I say I'm a medical toxicologist, they're like, what is that? And so I will explain to this group that the medical toxicologist is an individual who's done a fellowship and training in the treatment of various kinds of poisons. It can be environmental poisons, natural toxins such as plants or from animals and other sources. And to medical toxicologists, I will say this: numbers mean everything, as I'll explain later.
Thank you. Finally, we have Dr. Mark Edwards. He's a university distinguished professor in civil and environmental engineering at Virginia Tech. We want this panel to be informative and interactive, so throughout today's session, we will be asking you questions and inviting questions from you throughout the session. So we'll get started. By a show of hands, how many folks here have heard of the Flint Water Crisis? So almost everyone. Fantastic. By a show of hands, how many here believe that Flint children experienced an unprecedented lead contamination event that caused learning disabilities, brain damage?
The word unprecedented.
That's in there.
Unprecedented in the United States.
For drinking water.
Take the question as you will.
I saw a lot of hands go.
Okay, 50% perhaps? Good. Okay, we'll come back to that. That was the purpose of the question. I'll now go to Dr. Gomez for some perspective. Hernan, can you educate us a little bit on the history of lead exposure in America leading up to Flint? And as you answer, I'll put on a very important graph.
Thank you, Sid. So I'm going to give a little bit of perspective. I'm going to start with this graphic, which in my view, is perhaps one of the more important slides, maybe the most important of this whole discussion. And that is what I believe is truly a public health triumph in the United States over the past 50 years. I believe that this public health triumph is on a rank with the elimination of smallpox, the polio vaccine. It's on the same level. And the reason for that is that it's been shown over the years that higher lead levels, higher lifetime lead exposure, and I can't get this quite to work, but the higher lead level exposure, the greater the negative effect both in IQ and in behavior of children. The dotted line shows the marked drop in blood lead concentrations in the American population, and this is due to important measures such as, for example, the banning of gasoline from lead from tetraethyl lead from automobiles gasoline. And all of you who may be boomers like me perhaps remember that smell of leaded gasoline. Boy, it smelled great, actually. It did. And the banning of lead from paint in homes, and banning of lead in plumbing and fixtures and the like. So there's been a marked decrease in average concentrations, followed by the CDC threshold of concern also going down. It's been as high as 80. I don't see 80 up there, but high as 80 in the first Surgeon General report back in the day. But with the decline in lead levels, the decline also in the CDC lead threshold, which we will go into in more detail. But you may see that lead levels were in the 50s, earlier the 20th century, down to 2015, down to less than 1 microgram per deciliter. Now, I'm in here in front of you all in part for memories. Besides living through the lead Flint Water Crisis and practicing before that, I was trained in pediatrics in a city not far from here, about an hour and a half to the north. About 100,000 in population, Waterbury, Connecticut. And Waterbury, Connecticut's civic pride back in the day was the description of themselves as the brass capital of the world. And they were back in the day. But when I did my training, that was long gone. When I entered Waterbury as a naive Midwesterner, there were abandoned buildings, broken windows, the center of Waterbury, older homes, peeling paint, outdated plumbing. The city demographics population were majority a minority, about 33% white, and overall not economically particularly prosperous. And anyone who knows Flint, Michigan will recognize the things that I described. The average lead levels in Waterbury children during that time were between 8 and 12 micrograms per deciliter. I'm going to throw some numbers around, and I do so with some hesitation because I think every time I throw a number, I'm going to lose an audience member or two. But 8 to 12 and about 80 to 90% of these above 5 micrograms per deciliter would be considered scandalous by today's standards. But in fact, when I was in Waterbury in the mid-1980s, it was actually a marked improvement to what had occurred earlier. Now, there had been ongoing research done in terms of lead exposure in this country. For example, in 1979 began the onset of a very important investigation, longitudinal study, prospective study, called the Cincinnati Longitudinal Lead Study, which began in 1979, whose driving force was a principal investigator named Kim Dietrich. Through his research, Cincinnati Longitudinal Lead Study and other studies, further information was garnered to show that even low lead exposures can cause negative cognitive effects in children. So in 1991, there was a marked decrease in what the CDC would accept. It went down to 10 micrograms per deciliter. Now, mind you, 80 to 25 to 30 when I was in Waterbury, down to 10. And this is based on empiric research showing negative effects on cognition. 20 years later was another profound change with the CDC. And the CDC lowered the threshold of concern 20 years later in 2012 from 10 to 5 micrograms per deciliter. But this methodology, with this methodology, the CDC switched from a level of concern to a blood lead reference level in children using the 97.5th percentile in blood lead surveys. Specifically in the year 2012, 2.5% of children had a blood level higher than 5, therefore 5 micrograms per deciliter became the blood lead reference level. Are you confused by what I just said? Tell me the truth.
No, but I see the shift.
Are you okay? You see it? I'd say that many, I will simply say, if some of you are confused by this, I can assure you that the reason in part of the sensation known as the Flint Water Crisis occurred was because of confusion of what I just said. And the principal investigator I mentioned earlier, Kim Dietrich, warned the CDC that this lower number, which is more of a statistical calculation without a clearly defined health basis to be applied to the individual child, would be misinterpreted and misused as a hard threshold to label a child lead poisoned. But Kim was overruled. Now, he then recommended to the CDC, okay, you're going to overrule me with this decision, but I tell you what, This is confusing as hell. How about we publish a 2-page laminated pamphlet carefully explaining why it was lowered and how to appropriately interpret this so that physicians, clinicians, and public health had actionable guidelines. He was declined for this as well. So fast forward 2 years later to the events of the Flint Water Crisis, perhaps predictably, the media misinterpreted the meaning of 5 micrograms per deciliter and termed every child in Flint as being lead poisoned above 5. This reference level, again, reference level, not meant to be applied to any individual child, was suddenly applied to all Flint children. And eventually, in the media, all Flint children were described in media as being lead poisoned, whether they reached 5 micrograms per deciliter or not. So that's where we are today.
Thank you. And this problem, unfortunately, is not limited to Flint. The CDC's blood lead threshold, as you just heard, is no longer health-based, it's now population-based, meaning it'll be revised every 4 years such that 2.5% of American children are always above it and therefore lead poisoned. Another problem is distortion of language. The scientific consensus around lead, like other carcinogens, is there's no safe, this is confusing too, there's no safe level of lead exposure has been identified, which has now morphed into there is no safe level of lead. And the difference is not merely semantic, it has been adopted as formal policy by the US White House, public health agencies, academics, pediatricians, the media, elsewhere, where implying essentially any level of exposure irreversibly hurts you and your child. It also goes against Toxicology 101 in that the dose is what makes the poison. If you're a young parent, you can very well imagine the long-term psychological consequences of being told there is no safe level and that your child is lead poisoned because they have, even if they have a very low blood lead level. So this begs the question, which I'll pose to Dr. Edwards. Mark, how did we get here? Are there historical events that led us to Flint?
Yeah, the third major event that contributed to the Flint Water Crisis is quite simply government science agency corruption. And what we're talking about is the very agencies that are paid to protect us from lead in drinking water becoming environmental criminals and hiding the fact there's high lead in drinking water from us. And I learned this the hard way in 2003. I was a naive 40-year-old professor. I wasn't super trusting of government science agencies. I'd question their interpretation. But I also never expected that they would fabricate scientific data. And I witnessed it 3 times in 3 years. First, the water company knew lead in water was high in DC, in our nation's capital, in the Congress, in the White House for 3 years, and they covered it up completely by falsifying data. When they got caught, it was exposed in the Washington Post. It became a huge national media sensation. 7 congressional investigations, questions of President Bush, was he drinking lead in water before he went into the Iraq War? It was a circus. And then the CDC, the US Centers for Disease Control, came to town and claimed they did a study and used falsified data to claim that no one got hurt and that the DC lead crisis was much ado about nothing. And if that wasn't bad enough, I later caught the EPA fabricating yet another report completely. And I know this. It sounds simple. It took me 7 years and over $1 million in lawsuits and Freedom of Information Act requests to do it. I was ultimately vindicated in the Washington Post in a 2010 congressional hearing where the agencies were just reamed for their scientific misconduct. And at the time, I was hopeful they got caught, they will reform, nothing like that will ever happen again. But unfortunately, that wasn't their attitude. Their attitude seemed to be, we got caught, nothing happened to us, no one got fired, so what? So I knew at the time that if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. And so like a crazy person, I toured the country for 4 years and warned that the agencies are corrupt. Something like DC is going to happen again, and when it does, it's not going to be pretty. And unfortunately, I was correct, because in 2014, the Flint Water Crisis occurred, and it was the same actors operating the same way, the utility hiding the high linen water, the state and the EPA covering it up purposefully, and we had a problem on our hands. And there was an EPA whistleblower, one of my best friends, who was on the inside telling me this was it. This was the next DC. We're behaving criminally. He put his whole career on the line to get this exposed, and he was retaliated against by EPA. And so when that happened, when we exhausted every opportunity to give the system to work, we know we had a fight on our hands, and that we had to kind of go to war to expose the Flint Water Crisis. And so that's what we did. We launched a collaboration with Flint residents to do the job the agencies would not do, which was to test the water. And we proved there was a citywide lead problem. I FOIA'd the agency emails. Of course, I knew from insiders that they'd be very incriminating, and they were. I also set up a web page, and Sid kind of ran it, where we kind of engaged the media, because if you're in this asymmetrical battle with government powers, you got to fight to win. And so we borrowed from the sociological literature. Joseph Campbell told the heroic journey of Flint residents, and kind of they were cast as sort of the perfect victims, and we also had the government bureaucrats as perfect villains, and that was very successful. And some amazing things started to happen. We exposed the problem. We also continued and worked and showed that there was a Legionnaire's disease outbreak as a result of what was going on that killed 11 people. So this was a real environmental crime that was exposed completely by outsiders, and at that point it became an international, national media sensation, and President Obama declared a federal emergency. And it was quite interesting, because there were 11 civil servants initially indicted. There was hope that irresponsible bureaucrats would be held accountable. They all got off. I'll spoil the story for you. The government actually apologized to me on television, and I was asked, after fighting these agencies and calling them out for 15 years because they lost all credibility, to come and help them. And I agreed to do that. So one day you're fighting these people, and the next day you're in the room helping them. And so these are amazing things that don't happen, but in which did. And I was, at the time, I was just very, very hopeful that we, as a society, could learn something from this positive, so that this kind of problem would not happen again. But I was also worried, because at that time I knew that what happened was the agencies were so exposed, they had lost all public trust. And that created a vacuum, which was very dangerous, because there's the Latin phrase, horror vacui, nature abhors a vacuum. When you lose trust, something else will move in to fill it. And what was about to move in was celebrities, I guess crass careerist academics, drawn to Flint like moths to the flame. And the other thing that came to town were trial lawyers, because this looked like a great case for a large class action lawsuit. And so with that, Sid, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Like we said, we want this to be interactive, so we have a few minutes for questions before we continue. You go first, and we go to him.
How is it possible that after those committee hearings, I'm not sure, in 2010, that, did you say not a single person lost?
There were 5 whistleblowers at the agencies who were fired. They lost their jobs, but none of the perpetrators of the DC lead crisis lost their job.
Did the 5 whistleblowers get reinstated?
Some of them got up to $300,000, but they never worked in the field again. And no one ever thanked them for what they did, their sacrifices.
I'm just trying to reconcile obviously high levels of lead in the water, which is not surprising. But with also the ratcheting down of the standard, not necessarily against a health basis, to try and understand then what those levels of water actually produced for an actual crisis to, just for my own information.
We're about to get into that, but one of the things I'll tell you that was unique about the Flint lead and water situation is that when lead was high, very often the water was highly discolored. You'll see those pictures of folks holding up the water jugs that with iron in the water. And so to a large extent, there was a built-in aesthetic warning there that they didn't know the lead in water was high, but oftentimes when lead in water was high, it was so discolored, people would not drink it. And many people in Flint weren't going to drink water from the Flint River anyway. So that's how it's possible you could have high lead in water and not as much exposure as you might have in a normal situation.
We have time for one more question. In the back, yes.
I think that initially, like everything else, it started with innocent mistakes. And unfortunately, I've learned in my career it's human nature to try to cover those mistakes up, that rather than be honest about your mistake with the public. I think in general, the public's very forgiving of mistakes that scientists and engineers make, just like politicians, by the way. But what they're not forgiving of is a cover-up. And so that's what happened. It starts with an innocent mistake. Someone covers it up, and suddenly it just keeps snowballing and snowballing until you got this giant, big government lie. I could map it out for you. It's just incredible to see.
Perfect. So, more questions for all of you. Before this background discussion, how many of you suspected that Flint children were hospitalized or worse because of the crisis from lead? It's a good 25%. Okay. And we know exactly where you got that. You got that from reading Time magazine, from the New York Times, from hundreds of publications, not to mention your Facebook and Twitter feeds. Hernan, what was going on in Flint after the crisis was uncovered?
Well, I'd like to answer that question, but since we're looking at the Time magazine cover and sick children, I just want to point out one thing. Lead doesn't cause skin rashes. So what you're looking at in Time magazine is eczema. This is a dry skin condition common in children. There are treatments for that. This is not from lead. So you can see there was already mistakes being made in the media, but it was quite the media sensation. It was unbelievable. I mean, Flint doesn't get this kind of attention normally. It was a documentary, Roger and Me, from Roger Moore back in the day. That's when I saw it, and I said to myself, there's no way in hell I'm going to live and work in Flint, Michigan. Are you kidding me? But I am working in Flint, Michigan. And so it was a huge national sensation. There are politicians, media, folks in the entertainment world. I hate to leave out any celebrities' names, but celebrities such as Cher, Mark Wahlberg, Sean Combs is in the news in New York, I hear. Sean Combs, Aretha Franklin, Mark Ruffalo, and others announced their positive intention to raise relief funds publicly. It was an election year, national politics were introduced. There was a presidential debate between Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, and White Auditorium, you may recall. And in a blending of local politics and entertainment, there was a big summit conference between Snoop Dogg and the mayor in Flint. According to several accounts, after the declaration of federal emergency, there was a buzz tour of celebrities asked to visit the lead wards at the Children's Hospital in Flint to comfort the wards full of sick, lead-poisoned children. And so do you know how many children were hospitalized? How many? And the answer is 0. And 0 children, that's a good thing. I mean, I view it as positive, but 0 children in Flint required admissions because no children had really symptoms of lead intoxication. No child reached a lead level requiring medicine to emergently reduce lead levels. And in the meantime, in multiple areas of the state, such as Benton Harbor to the east, Benton Harbor to the west, Detroit to the east, they were experiencing far higher lead levels. And in the case of Detroit, I've had multiple conversations with the director of the lead clinic in Detroit, and it was fairly common to have emergent lead levels in admission in Detroit, both during the Flint Water Crisis and now. So, again, fortunately, no Flint children required hospitalization or any form of emergency treatment for lead intoxication. That's a good thing.
Mark, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think before we launched our intervention and collaboration with Flint residents, I actually wrote down a list of things that was going to make Flint just a huge, huge story. And I'll give you a partial list here. First and foremost on my list was Flint's the poorest city in America, and Americans, God bless us, we root for the underdog. I knew that there were brave EPA whistleblowers, and there were very incriminating emails that I could get by Freedom of Information Act requests. We're also aided by cartoonishly malfeasant government officials who paid the role of just evil villain perfectly. We had articulate parents and activists, but the one that really stood out, and I underlined it 3 times, was that Flint was a unique situation. Because in hundreds of other cities that had high lead in their water at this time, it's the government local utility that's providing the water. And if you feel you're wrong, you can try to sue. You have to clear the burden of sovereign immunity, but ultimately you're suing yourself, because if you win, your water rates just go up. In Flint, the state was running the water system. And so you had a deep pockets that trial lawyers could sue in a class action. And that was a dynamic coupled with the other things that made all the difference. And so I'd heard the old joke, there's hell hath no fury like a trial lawyer pursuing a class action lawsuit. When aided by supportive press, that was absolutely true. The story became a sensation. And the thing I didn't appreciate after seeing the narrative get going, though, was the fact that once a narrative like this gets started, it's impossible to stop.
Hernan.
Okay, well, with this national uproar in the Flint area, again, I'm a medical toxicologist. I communicate with my toxicology colleagues across the country. There's about 300 of us. And we communicate through listservs, email messages back and forth. And there was a huge frustration amongst toxicologists. Again, this reached, national, really international level. And there was a frustration that there was a lack of actual blood lead levels to look at and to assess what the concerns were in Flint. Percentages above 5, which were published, were not enough to understand what was going on in Flint. At least one toxicologist familiar with Michigan expressed concern, and I quote, this is a quote from her, "Flint kids are being used as pawns." And this was fairly early on during the crises. A request to view the actual blood lead levels from me were declined, so with the help of my co-authors, we designed our own study. We did obtain blood lead data with the approval of the hospital's IRB, and published this in the Journal of Pediatrics. And you may see, this is from 2006, we go through the crisis, and you may see there's a sort of a steady decline in blood lead levels, overall decline. I don't know if we can get that to work. Oh, thank you. Decline. And the overall trend, the ups and downs, were really pretty maintained, even in spite of the Flint Water Crisis. This is when the water switch occurred, and these were levels in children during the height, 1.13, and then back down to record levels. It increased by 0.11 micrograms per deciliter and rapidly decreased. The percentage above 5, since that's been bandied about quite a bit, were about 3.7% during the height of the crisis with our study. When I was in Waterbury, Connecticut, going back to memories, 80 to 90% above 5 micrograms per deciliter, and that was pretty much common throughout the United States. Given these data, knowing the levels in other communities within the country, other areas of Michigan, Detroit, by the way, lead levels were 8% above 5 micrograms per deciliter. So with this knowledge, I presented these data to the hospital, the annual physician meeting. There was a resolution passed with unanimous not to use the term poisoned in children with the concerns that this may be not helpful and perhaps psychologically harmful to families. Now, I will acknowledge, and I should take a moment to mention my understanding that the word poison means different things to different people. It's a common literary metaphor. For example, political discussions and communications over the past 4 years are poisoned. I don't know if anyone would argue with that. But with Flint and with the discussion of poisoned, we're not using literary metaphors. The definition of poison to a medical toxicologist is measurable and organ damage. And this had not occurred. I co-authored an op-ed with Kim Dietrich, the same Kim Dietrich of the Cincinnati Longitudinal Lead Study that was published in the New York Times, expressing our concerns of using this term and also the simple concept that perhaps families and parents should be reassured in this matter and not frightened. So we're going to make a slight transition here for a minute. What might be worse than hearing all that your children are brain damaged because they drank the water? Perhaps if you're a young parent trying to make a family and being told that perhaps after suffering a miscarriage that your pregnancy was terminated due to the drinking water. And this actually happened. Now if we can go to the next one here. Very good. So I peruse on a daily basis New York Times and the Washington Post, and this came up. Flint's lead-poisoned water had a horrifyingly large effect on fetal death study finds. The analysis, if you were to read this article, the analysis was an article by 2 economists, and the analysis concluded that fetal death rates increased by 58% in what was described as a culling of the least healthy fetuses. Now, I grew up in an agricultural state. We used the culling to refer to livestock. So I was horribly offended even by the wording with this article. But there was a regression analysis. It was not peer-reviewed. And it was the authors reached this conclusion without the benefit of actual blood lead levels. I studied this with some co-authors, and we found that blood lead levels in females in Flint had not increased at all, nor had they reached a level even approaching what historically has been shown to cause miscarriages. Now, days after this was published, I suspect some members of the community may have been reassured, but there was a group of 20 activists, including some local academicians, who burst into the hospital executive meeting at the main medical center where I work, wearing jumpsuits covered in red paint from the chest on down to the nether regions to symbolize losing blood from miscarriages. And they were demanding I get fired. They flat out. And so the rationale in this guy Gomez getting fired was that if he is unable to recognize that lead is an emergency to the community, how on earth can we trust him to recognize an emergency in the emergency room? And, and the CEO, much to her credit, her name is Melanie Gavulik, she turned to them and she said, there is a construct known as academic freedom. I cannot fire him from the emergency department. So I have to give her some credit. I think I'm all set.
While Hernan was fighting these battles, we were dealing on our own front an increasingly out of control narrative during this federal emergency because, again, of the major trust vacuum that had been created by government misconduct. I'll give you a few examples. There was the case of the actor Mark Ruffalo, who plays the Hulk, as you know. He and his team came to Flint with a green, spongy pom-pom thingy, started throwing that into people's bathtubs and kitchen sinks to take samples, and then hand out 80, 90-page reports of all the chemicals that his team had found without context or what those numbers might mean. Their unscientific messaging clearly was it is not safe to bathe or shower in the water, which was, again, contrary to all official guidance that, yes, there is lead in the water, please don't drink it, perhaps use a filter, but continue with basic sanitation and hygiene. Media coverage of this circus of essentially coincided with residents not bathing and showering, and which at the time there was a major diarrheal disease outbreak. We exposed this pseudoscience, but it took some time and resources. Second, there were instances of residents actually cheating on their water testing during the emergency to claim that the water quality was not improving despite switching back to the original source, lead pipe replacements, and improvements in water treatment. Most prominent was the case of how someone had inserted, I kid you not, lead fishing sinkers into their bathtub spigot and taken water samples to get lead levels in the thousands. What was more scary, though...
And file a lawsuit against the state.
Exactly. What was more scary, though, that this resident actually posted her blood lead results, which were in the 30s, which was very, very scary to us as to how this could have happened, and tried to raise money through a GoFundMe. Then there was the case of Michigan academics who published a non-peer-reviewed conference paper stating that the water lead filters that had been handed out by FEMA to residents and that are in use in tens of millions of our homes somehow killed Flint residents. The study that they conducted had a test arm of 10 homes in Flint and a control arm of, ready for it, 1 home in Detroit. They would not tell us if the residents died before or after these filters were installed. PBS Frontline actually used that as their cornerstone evidence in their documentary. The academics in question have faced no consequences, and their journal refuses to retract this stupid study. I give you a few examples. We, all three of us, have been repeatedly attacked by activists and professors for calling out bad science that, in our opinion, hurt public welfare. We've been ambushed at conferences by activists, have had anonymous letters published online claiming our actions were unethical, sent those letters to our employers saying that we be investigated. We've been subpoenaed. We've received cease and desist letters from lawyers. MARC also got some death threats. Some in the audience have experienced similar things, and to them I just want to say, we completely understand. But back to fetal deaths, that's an important question. Could fetal deaths have increased? They did in Washington, D.C. Let's look at the study. It was a preprint, non-peer-reviewed, by 2 economists. The increase was not statistically significant, but if you look at their language, the abstract says culling of fetuses. Their discussion says horrifyingly large increase, which is what the Washington Post used in their headline, right? The final paper that passed peer review makes no mention of the fetal death numbers at all. And yet, the academics promoted their preprint through university press releases, YouTube videos, and dozens of headlines. You can only imagine the anguish it had caused Flint families on top of everything else. You know, we, on our front, spent 3 years looking at this on our own and found that it was highly unlikely that based on the lead levels we were seeing in Flint, that there would have been an increase in fetal deaths. And you know, I want to move on to something else, the children that we are talking about. At the time during the emergency, we were doing science outreach and actually went to Flint to schools to tell the kids what had actually happened and encourage them to look at STEM as a possible option in their future, because science is the engine that moves humanity forward, and helped uncover the crisis. During our visit to many of these schools, we heard from teachers who said, well, the kids in our classrooms cannot learn because of all the lead in their brains. They are brain damaged. They cannot learn. Why try? This was perplexing based on the data, but also heartbreaking for many reasons. And here is one that I think you saw Hernan's numbers, and I'll show you ours. It's somewhat different, but I think makes the point equally well, is that here is a graph of percentage of children with elevated blood lead over the past decade, okay? You have, on the x-axis, you have time. On the y-axis, you have percentage. The middle portion is the crisis. And what we've done here is compared Flint to nearby Detroit. The beauty of Detroit as a control is, I cannot emphasize enough, because both cities have used the same water source for more than 50 years, except the 18 months that Flint was on the Flint River. So it's a perfect control. And what you see here is, over the past decades, blood lead is dropping. However, look at the black line. That's kids in Detroit. For the entire past decade, the blood lead in Detroit children is twice or higher than that of Flint children, including the height of the crisis. Compare Flint, which is the red line, to Michigan, and what you're essentially seeing is that Flint is essentially statistically indistinguishable from the Michigan average. That slight elevation in 2014, that was the crisis. Flint was an environmental crime, absolutely. The folks who caused it should be in jail. They are not, but it was a crime. But in terms of health effects, when it comes to lead specifically, that elevation, that was the crisis. But this has not stopped the media, academics, experts, who continue to insist that all Flint children are lead poisoned. A class action lawsuit that was recently settled for more than $600 million was predicated on this very fact, where doctors, lawyers, and others defended that all Flint children were lead poisoned. So our second key message here is that many in the public health community, academia, and even the media are willing to lie, obfuscate, or at the very least stay silent because in their mind they're helping Flint children. Is it a surprise that science and scientists are not trusted as much, right? Okay, we're end of part 2. We have about 5 minutes for questions. So please fire away.
That would assume that data and facts matter. And they don't. When you're in this kind of narrative, it doesn't matter. That's it. I mean, look at, is anyone telling Detroit kids that they are brain damaged and can't learn? No. All right?
In the back.
Do you think there's like a
Yes, in addition to the lawsuit, I agree with Jonathan Haidt and colleagues who've written on victimization culture. And in our society, as a victim, you're at the pinnacle. And who are we to take that away from people if that's the story, especially if it can help them get money? And by the way, I'm all for helping poor people get money, but I'm just against lying to them and others in order to achieve that. But it's part of this narrative, it's part of victimization culture, and in the media, it is loath to cover these facts.
What percentage of Flint children had levels that were like greater than 30 micrograms per deciliter?
We studied from the earliest time, and Sid in his paper studied it, at every level above 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, no observable effect of the elevated lead in water. The only threshold above which there was anything statistically significant was 5. And as Hernan pointed out, just 2 years before the crisis, the level of concern was dropped to 5. Otherwise, no one would have cared about that.
I should add, during the 18 months, there were 28 tested children across the state of Michigan who had a blood lead above 45. 14 were in Detroit, 0 in Flint. If that helps. In the back.
My name is Megan Dell. I'm not an academic. I'm a writer and a podcaster. So a couple weeks ago, I interviewed an author of a new book. It's called Murderland. It has to do with the lead poisoning hypothesis and the relationship between that and serial killers. In this case, this is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. She was making a connection. She was asking the question, why so many serial killers? First of all, why were there so many between 1970 and 1990, and why were they overrepresented in the Pacific Northwest? And so she ties in this lead poisoning hypothesis, which she did not invent. This exists. I'm sure you're familiar with it. And the idea being that people who were growing up near, manufacturing bases and plant factories that were putting a lot of lead into the atmosphere, especially, lumber, in the foresting realm, that kind of thing, they would over-index for the kind of brain damage that would cause sociopathy. And I don't, it seemed highly speculative to me, but I have found it fascinating that this book is being reviewed, getting rave reviews in places like the Washington Post, and this central framing is not even questioned. So my question for you is, what do you know about lead poisoning hypothesis with regard to this, sociopathy and psychopathy more broadly?
Hernan, do you want to take that?
Well, there is a clear there are a clear indication that criminal behavior, I don't know if I can say specifically what you outlined with this book, but there is a clear connection between chronic lead levels and toxicity with criminal behavior. And there have been studies that have been published, and this may be one of the studies that have been published by the, in fact, Cincinnati Longitudinal Lead Study, which have shown decreased level of crime in certain communities over time as lead levels have gone down in the community. So there is a clear correlation with that, and I don't think there's any doubt that that exists, by the way. That's fairly well established.
I went to the University of Washington, home of Ted Bundy and the Green River Killer. And yeah, I mean, that hypothesis actually, looks good. But just keep in mind, in the 70s and 80s, you're talking almost 20, 30, 40 times more lead than today. And certainly, we're not talking for the exposures in Flint or even in Detroit, we're not at those levels. So there's no, we don't want, less lead exposure is always better, but just realize we're kind of reaching historical lows with every passing year, yeah.
One more.
What level of lead in the blood can be clearly stated to have deleterious effects on IQ or other medical? What's the level at which we all scientists, or great majority of scientists, would agree this is
Okay. So could you, I'll answer your question. I'm gonna ask you to repeat that phrase about no safe level of lead. You kind of summarized it very nicely. Can you do that again?
Right. So because lead is a classified carcinogen, the consensus is no safe level of exposure has been identified, which is true also for alcohol and tobacco smoke, for example.
Now, having said that, it is true that low lead levels of lead during the lifetime of a child does have a negative effect of IQ, particularly below. It's a bit of a curve that in the levels below 10, it seems to have a more of an effect, and above 10, a little bit less so, more of a plateau. Higher the lead level, the greater the effect of IQ. However, below the levels of 10 micrograms per deciliter, it has been shown that for every 1 microgram per deciliter appears to affect IQ approximately 0.5 to 1 IQ points for the lifetime of a child. So these are very real effects. And so for this reason, we're trying to eliminate overall lead from the environment completely.
Doesn't those data that you just cited, doesn't that justify the rationing down of acceptable levels from 10 to 5?
So the answer to that is that no one is debating whether one should eliminate lead from the environment or that lower levels are optimal. The problem is, sorry, if I understood your question correctly, is there a hard number threshold that we can say causes effect on IQ? And the answer is there is not. There is no such hard level. That doesn't exist. And I believe that is a reason for much of the confusion that we have in terms of lead threshold.
But part of it's confusion by design. So this is a sore point with all of us. We wrote an editorial on this. And for every other environmental contaminant, you force experts to get in a room and pick a number below which you're not going to be overly concerned, except for lead. Instead, we have this no safe level mantra, which means that each and every one of you is presently unsafe because you are presently breathing in atoms of lead as we speak, right? And since there's no safe level, you're unsafe. So there's no logical scientific reason that lead would be unique, except its sort of political history, both going forwards and kind of in the social justice arena, for not picking a number below which we're not going to be overly concerned. We don't have that now. You know?
Okay, we need to go back, but we'll pick up questions after. Okay, I'll read you a couple of quotes that are representative from 2 Flint teachers. Here's one, quote, "My students believe they were poisoned, that they have no control over their behaviors, and that they'll never recover from lead exposure," unquote. The second quote, "We have a school district where all that's left are damaged kids who are being exposed to other damaged kids, and it's causing more damage." So what we have here is fuel a John Haidt type ethical dilemma of truth versus social justice. I'm going to be asking you a couple of questions, and you have to pick a side. If you remain silent based on everything you know now, you can support the social justice goal of getting kids more money in these lawsuits. More money is more justice. Or you can try to speak out to put the exposure in perspective, or at least try to make sure Flint kids know what really happened to them, that they're not brain damaged, that they can learn. By a show of hands, how many of you will speak out? You have to pick a side.
Speaking which way?
That to children about what happened. Put things in perspective.
And publicly, would you tell the truth about the data and what happened in Flint? Raise your hand if you would betray the social justice goal.
Okay, 50,
Yeah.
45%. And who will stay silent to support the social justice goal? You have to pick. You can't be neutral in here.
Can I just ask a question? I went to the Honest Broker talk yesterday, which suggests there might be a
Not here.
I'm wondering if you would think of a third option that is maybe more acceptable to scientific integrity and concern.
Yes, you can try to talk to people about telling the truth with a capital T when they have different telos, if you will, different loyalties. I don't think you'll be successful.
We'll come back to questions. And I want to continue on this theme and give you a couple of, based on the quotes you heard, a couple of headlines. This is the front page of the Times that talks about a legacy of poisoned water, damaged kids fill Flint schools. What the article is talking about is skyrocketing special education enrollment in Flint public schools, which is now nearly double the state average. Whereas if you think about Detroit, which had nearly twice the blood lead, the numbers have been mostly stable and are dropping, actually. The second headline is from 60 Minutes. Perhaps you saw the special, where there's a new neuropsychological center in Flint that's testing and diagnosing children for learning disabilities. Their diagnosis rate right now is at 80%. So you've seen the lead data. The evidence could not be clearer in as much that lead exposure in Flint did not cause the rising special education enrollment. The question is, what did? And we looked at we looked at all the possible confounders, but believe part of the answer is what is called in psychology as the nocebo effect. Has anyone heard of this? 5%. Has anyone heard of the placebo effect? That's most people. Okay, perfect. So nocebo is kind of like the evil twin, where negative expectations and perceptions about a treatment or exposure are internalized, and they cause real physical long-term symptoms and health harm. You know, Flint was an international media sensation. An entire generation of children were told that they cannot learn, that they are poisoned. Class action lawsuit was also waged precisely on their behalf about this. This is why, part of the answer why we think kids are enrolling in special ed at record rates.
No, it's in a whole economy. It's a victimization capitalism culture.
Yeah. You'll not be surprised. This was not an easy finding to publish. It was actually rejected 13 times by 12 journals. We couldn't publish this in America. We had to find a collaborator in New Zealand, and we found a journal in Europe that could at least give us a fair review. But of all these reviews, I think the worst was from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And there were two reviewers. You know, one reviewer was very supportive because he looked at they looked at the blood lead data, and they were supportive of getting this out. The other reviewer said this, and I'm going to read this to you. For a chronically underserved community like that of Flint, Michigan, each opportunity to get more money for whatever reason is a big deal. And we all know that underserved communities most likely do not obtain extra funding by simply asking for it. One way in which such communities could, however, obtain more funding is by finding themselves in a situation like a natural disaster, or in the case of Flint, water contamination attracts the attention of government and media. Like Mark said, does this reviewer think we're opposed to communities in need getting money? No, but this is not a scientific review. This is a political review. And here's the next question. What about the psychological harm that befalls Flint children in the name of justice and getting more money. Does that enter our cost benefit? I'll give you one historical example to kind of make my point. In 1939, a professor with a speech impediment wanted to help children with speech impediments. They had problems with stuttering. So he devised a study and recruited orphans from an orphanage. This is before IRBs existed. And in their study arm, there was one study arm where 6 orphans who spoke normally were told repeatedly that they stuttered and they were belittled for the entirety of the study. Unsurprisingly, the orphans developed lifelong psychological problems, were awarded less than $1 million nearly 70 years after that event happened, and an apology from the University of Iowa. I think we've been doing this to Flint children in public view for a decade. Mark, I want to turn to you, how does this happen? How is this allowed?
Well, and I hope you can read the slide. We're talking about 13,000 children in Flint potentially affected by 8 years of being told that they've been permanently brain damaged by this large lead exposure. And you can only imagine what effect that has from hearing that from clergy, your parents, and your teachers, right? And so in 1990, when this private study was exposed in the New York Times, it created public outrage and a lawsuit and a settlement. And on the right, in Flint, this all unfolded publicly. And it is still going on, and yet there is no outrage. So my question to you is, what's changed? And 2 things that are on my list to consider are social justice and victimization culture.
I think we're nearing the end. We have a few minutes, and then we'll open this up for questions. Hernan and Mark, as we wrap up, for example, doctors, we are driven by the Hippocratic Oath. Engineers, we are driven by ethical canons of engineering to hold paramount the health, safety, and welfare of the public. We faced numerous ethical dilemmas, and while practicing intellectual humility, we've tried to do the right thing to uphold public welfare, and punished as a consequence. But other academics and journalists tell the story that people want to hear, are rewarded. What does the future look like for STEM, and especially medicine and public health? Do we see a course correction? Do we have a reason for hope? Hernan, you want to go first?
Well, I will say you mentioned, I think you might have mentioned Hippocratic Oath. I certainly have heard the certain phrase throughout this conference of several times prior to this particular meeting. But the well-known phrase, prima non nocere, which is first do no harm. And I would state that a great deal of harm has taken place both by physicians and other academics regarding the Flint Water Crisis. The CDC blood reference level, with the future periodic revisions based on survey statistics, has been an ongoing source of confusion and at best, at worst, a permanent health scare. The CDC's fine print specifically states that the reference level is not to be applied as a threshold of poisoning, but this fine print is routinely misunderstood or at worst exploited. Flint has been referred to as America's Bhopal. Are you familiar with Bhopal? Is anyone? Or America's Chernobyl, America's Minamata. But let's focus on America's Bhopal, where in 1984, a toxic release of methyl isocyanate from a Union Carbide factory caused the immediate death of 3,700 immediately, and deaths from chronic disease from 20,000, according to Amnesty International. So Flint is not Bhopal, to say the least. self-styled advocates in the academic world, these are perhaps clever words, things like America's Bhopal, but many believe there may be no harm in using this kind of language. The problem is that these outrageous comparisons have the effect of inflating the scope of what occurred to Flint and minimizing the trauma of Bhopal and Minamata or Chernobyl. Worse yet, I believe that there is very real psychological damage that occurs if parents and children actually believe this kind of language. That's where there's a real problem. So.
Mark?
We just have some final comments. We've talked about our problems with STEM faculty, and as Alice has pointed out, there's nothing more difficult than questioning your colleagues and friends. And so that has been really, really tough. But we have encountered people from the social scientists and social justice world who have funded in Flint to restore trust to the community. And I just wanted to share with you some of their written quotes about what they view their role is in Flint. These are their words. One of the people involved is from Kettering University. He's gotten grants to work in Flint to restore the public trust, and he says, at the end of the day, my project is less on the truth of the crisis with a capital T and more around the struggle around the crisis. And sometimes when you're engaged in a struggle, truth is your ally and sometimes it isn't. We who struggle have our truth, a truth with a small t, tactically tailored to our needs and objectives. And by the way, the utility of a particular narrative sometimes inversely related to its accuracy. This is people who are restoring the trust in Flint. Another person who's been funded to work in Flint has written that all data is cooked. There's no such thing as raw data. Any presentation of the data is not neutral. We don't just say, I'm giving you the data, it's raw, you have to cook it. I've been thinking about the needs to move up from a model of citizen science in terms of collecting data on yourselves. The goal of collecting the data is to have your story validated. So these are the folks that I mentioned. You can try to reason with them and talk about truth with a capital T, and it's just not part of their existence, basically. And so I'll also end this with a 1915 AAUP Declaration of Principles that warned if our profession, academia, is unwilling to purge its ranks of incompetent and unworthy or prevent the freedom of which it claims in the name of science from being used as a shelter for inefficiency, superficiality, or uncritical or intemperate partisanship, it is certain that the task will be performed by others. So with that, we will open it up for questions. Alice, you had your hands up many times. Yeah.
Thank you. This was very informative. I appreciate all you're doing. So, as you know, Mark, I've been embedded in Michigan journalism, so I'm a big fan of Bridge, Michigan, because it does nonpartisan reporting. And in May 2024, it actually covered what you're talking about.
It was the first journalistic adventure into the nocebo effect, where they would mention it.
Quoting you saying, to be sure, Edward said what happened in Flint is an American tragedy, born of government malfeasance, but he and a growing chorus of scientists say that the ongoing struggles of children in Flint are not from lead, but from the hyperbolic reaction to the crisis that has lowered expectations for a generation and become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So what I want to ask you is, why did Bridge tell this different story, and how did you get them to do that, and what came to this story?
They've done a very good job of dealing with data and believing data and questioning people, whereas my experiences with other major news outlets is the editorial departments are afraid of this story. I won't mention the name of the newspapers who told me they were going to write on this story and put their toe in the water and ran away from it, in my opinion, of outright fear of how their stories would be treated.
So did anything come of the Bridge story?
It's out there. It's the first story. That's more than we could get for 4 years prior to that right?
Thanks. I feel like sometimes we conflate what the media does with what the CDC does. And you talked about the fine print, and I saw that during the pandemic as well. I think they give recommendations, and then people, the public and the media, they interpret it however they want, they sensationalize it, but there's some purpose on the public health interventions. And I think there's a fine balance on how you communicate to the public, and obviously not everyone is educated like this audience or like you, and it's really hard to communicate public health messages in a way that everyone understands. So I wonder, I mean, I know you did the work and went to the schools and explained, but how do you communicate with the whole country about a problem with lead? And the message of no, no lead is safe, or however that message was, to me, the intention behind is not so bad in the sense that, yes, it is bad for cognitive development, right? So wouldn't be our goal wouldn't it have to be to have no lead at all in the water, even though knowing that it's not going to cause major damage at low levels, but still, as a public health agency, why is it so bad that you would want to have no lead as a goal? And there's a lot of questions.
Is it me? I can tell you that the 5 micrograms per deciliter, how the CDC means for this to be interpreted. It's just that it's a bit confusing. So you're a practicing physician, you're a pediatrician, you have a child Medicaid. There are Medicaid rules and requirements to obtain blood levels in young children. You get a blood level, it comes back 7, let's say, or it comes back 6, or it comes back 5. What that means is that you take this number and you look into what the source of lead exposure might be. Is it from the water? Is it from the lead paint? Perhaps you do some actionable things, like, for example, there are resources typically. Every state has resources for lead mitigation in the household. Maybe the child needs to stay with grandma for a while. All these things are positive and should be put into place. This is not what it's not meant to be. Is for the parents there with the child in the doctor's office, you get the level back, it comes back 5, to turn to the mother and say, your child is lead poisoned and brain damaged. That's not supposed to be what it is. And the problem is that second inappropriate response has been now taken inappropriately and misused. So again, it is confusing because there is no known safe level of lead. There are, I think, legitimate comparisons to a carcinogen. And I hate to kind of belittle lead, but in a way, one shouldn't be exposed to asbestos. Why? Because it causes mesothelioma. So lifetime exposure for years causes mesothelioma. But should you walk into a construction site, walk through a building, which I've dealt with in the ER, people walk through a building, they find out that there is asbestos within the building, they come panicking to the emergency department. And I tell them, this is like smoking cigarettes and inhaling secondhand smoke, just stay away from it now. So yes, it is a carcinogen, but let's keep things in context.
Let me just say really quickly, too, the damage from what's happened in Flint is not just limited to Flint children. It has created an epidemic of distrust in drinking water for poor and minority communities all across the United States. And this no safe level messaging has caused many of our poorest Americans to spend their precious financial resources on bottled water and $3,000 filter systems when they don't need it because they are afraid that they might be the next Flint. And in terms of this no safe level, to give you one example of how absurd it is, in Chicago, just a few months ago, they had a expose on their local news. Chicago has detectable lead in its water. We're going to have major problems with our children's IQ being lower, bad behavior, future incarceration because of this. What levels were they talking about? 1 part per billion lead, which is 1/5 of the allowable amount of lead in bottled water. I'm not making this up, people. This is insanity. This is like creating a public health scare that is having all kinds of consequences and financial repercussions. We can't afford to be creating these kind of worries amongst people at such ridiculously low levels of lead.
Other questions? In the back.
Thank you for the presentation. So when I hear a presentation like this, part of me thinks, of course we need some kind of formal mechanism of accountability for academics who will misleadingly frame non-findings in a case like this in a way that causes active harm to people. At the same time, I'm wary of trying to articulate what that would be or what that would look like. So I think the question framed in the title of this was helpful: academic freedom and academic responsibility. I think they're just things. I just wanted to hear if any of you had opinions on, would you suggest something like a mechanism of accountability? What would that look like? Or is it just more about having a culture of skepticism on the part of the public?
Well, that's why I put that quote up there, because I think we're seeing some of the accountability today for our irresponsibility. If we're not going to police ourselves, others will police us. And that was what they were warning about in 1915. The other thing I'll say is that none of these professors who I believed engaged in ethically questionable activity, including the people who wouldn't answer the question that claimed the filters were killing people, but wouldn't answer the question, did the people die before the filters went in, right? They've been rewarded for their involvement. Many of these groups have gotten millions and millions of dollars of grants. No consequences that I can see. But we're the bad people for pointing out this questionable behavior by other scientists, because you just do not do that, right?
If anyone hasn't asked a question, we'll go to them first. In the back, yeah. We'll come to you.
I'm David Stoll. I'm an anthropologist. Thank you for explaining the situation I had no glimmer of. When I Google up the origins of the crisis, Edwards and Roy, you helped identify the problem. And 10 years ago or 9 years ago, you were accurately quoted as saying that there had been a concealment going on. That then attracts this media buffalo. You continue to study the problem. You become much more knowledge about it, but the media buffalo just goes out of control and rampages.
Driven by billions of dollars.
And
Yeah,
it becomes this economic engine of advance
right, right.
for people who are basically willing to find something that will bring them money, and at that point it dampens their curiosity, and they're only going to report what keeps the money coming. Is that an accurate sort of macro chronology of what goes on here?
Yeah, but with the empathy that I've seen what professors do for $1 million, we lose our minds. We're talking billions potential in front of a very poor city. So yeah, I mean, I'm very empathetic to the situation and the motivations that people have here.
In the back.
Can we go back to the question that you asked us? How many of you think that you would, stand up? I suspect that it's not as many as raised their hands. And there was essentially no one in the room who was willing to raise their hand and said, I'd say I wouldn't. And I think legitimately looking for a third option. Personally, as someone who works now with essentially an entire university who looked for the third option or refused to speak up for my science, which had an inconvenient finding, I'm wondering if you could go back to that and talk just a little bit about your personal, the price, just away from the science a little bit. How are you doing personally at home, at work, friends, relationships?
Who wants to go first?
I can tell you that I'm messed up beyond all belief. This is 20 years I've been doing this. I've burned so many bridges behind me by telling the truth. I can't get funded. Okay, that's all right. One of the hardest things about telling the truth in Flint is that I finally had friends for a brief moment in my life because our scientific data showed that they were right, but the second our data showed something different, I knew I was going to lose my friends. And that, that was very, very hard, just as much as all the other struggles. Yeah.
Hernan?
Well, I was going to say that, well, sometimes it's good to not have friends. I really don't have friends, so so I'm as I was before. One thing is that I was married prior to the Flint Water Crisis, and I'm still married, and she's right over there, so that's probably a good thing. So that's probably a good thing. So that's all I have to comment on that.
The only thing I'll add is I was on the job market for a good 4 years, and this does not make you popular, as you can imagine. Yeah, I will not tell you how many universities I've interviewed at and the conversations I've had and the confrontations. But every year, there was a point that I would give up and be like, okay, academia is not for me. I eventually found a home at Rutgers, but yeah, the mental health consequences, the professional price you pay is huge, and all of us are in really small fields when we think about it, with the number of people in our associations. We go to conferences, we get reviewed when it comes to funding and papers by usually the same group of people, and you pay a price. So personally, I mean, I have a bad memory, which helps, but it's not sufficient. So there are bad days to this day. We have time for one last question in the back.
I was born and raised in Flint, so I may have a little bit different perspective. But what do you think that the film Roger and Me, which was mentioned, the film Roger and Me, which was about stuff that really did happen, but that it identified Flint as a victim already in the national mind, that made it possible for everyone to jump on it?
Yeah, that was on my list of fact. Flint is always punched above its weight in terms of gaining media attention, partly for that reason, for the film. Roger, yeah.
Anything to
I just have to add, as a documentary filmmaker, that film, which is very entertaining, it was famously manipulative and shameful kind of stuff.
I have to comment on that film. That film, Roger and Me, was my first introduction to Flint. So you say you were born and raised in Flint? You're a Flintoid? All right. So Michael Moore famously is not really from Flint. He's from the nearby community named Davison. You know that, right? He's from Davison. He's not really a Flintoid, although the Roger and Me was my first introduction while I was in Connecticut as a young physician resident. I saw that movie. It's a very clever movie. I remember saying to myself, there is no way in hell I'm going to live or work in that community. There's no way. But in Flint we are. Once you are in Flint, you realize that it is a vibrant community in its own way. It does punch above its weight. It's a wonderful community. I love the people in Flint. I might add one more thing. Kim Dietrich, who I mentioned several times in this chat, Kim Dietrich used to work in the automobile industry repairing cars in Flint in the summers as working his way through college in Michigan. He's a Michigander, very familiar with Flint, loves the community.
Perfect. We could keep going, but we are at time. Thank you again for your participation. If you